Coming up, the New York Football Giants have an eye on the draft, and the Vikings and Chargers made a lot of moves in the last 24 hours that could improve, hurt, change the way Big Blue approaches their pick at the 6th overall spot. We dive in on it all coming up next. Yes, my friends. Welcome into OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're thinking about everything the Giants have done and what they could do. But Andy, while the Giants lie in wait for that draft, and maybe some little margin moves around free agency as well, other teams are making big splashes inside of the draft, already shaking up the mid to late first round draft capital here, and then looking at the top of the board too, starting with the Vikings and getting themselves a second first round pick.
Yeah, so the Vikings ended up working on a trade, Adam. And excuse anyone that's watching on YouTube. I obviously don't have my normal back screen here. Adam, it's been crazy. I'm down working on some client meetings. And of course, like we hear all this news and we're like, this clearly relates to the Giants. We got to jump in. We got to give the people what they want.
I didn't even comb my hair. Can you believe it, guys?
Unbelievable, Adam. So the Vikings sent their second round pick and a 6th round pick for this year, as well as a second round pick for next year to the Texans in exchange for the 23rd overall pick and a 7th rounder upcoming this year. And it's interesting because now this arms the Minnesota Vikings with 2 first round picks, pick 11, which is their pick, and pick 23, which is now courtesy of the Houston Texans. It feels like very eerily similar to what the Buffalo Bills have done and others, where it's let's see how many first round picks. Let's see if we can get the right draft capital to go up in the draft and make a huge swing. Now, what that swing is going to be and where they end up wanting to go, it's still to be determined. But obviously, anyone that's going to be trying to move in front of the Giants certainly would impact them, and this type of move certainly does that.
Yeah, it's interesting, man. I'm trying to think about this from a Viking standpoint, right? Like they signed Sam Darnold. They know they have somebody in the room. Kirk Cousins leaves, but they still have one of the best wide receivers in the class. We've talked about how, like, is there some world where they'd be willing to trade one of the best wide receivers, maybe the best wide receiver in the game because of where they are as a franchise? So it's like I can't fully decide if having 11 and 23 for the Vikings means we're coming up and we're going to talk about the Chargers and maybe that's the impact point here inside of the top 10 to get quarterback X. But is that where you want to get get the 4th best QB? Like that would seem odd for them. You can look at staying at 11 and 23 and just adding talent, right? Maybe there'll be a quarterback that falls there that you like. But if you have 2 picks in the first round, like to me, this feels a little bit more like, and I wonder if you agree, because this is all on the fly thinking about this. Oh, now we have 2 first round picks. So we can add 2 quality players, and we, the Minnesota Vikings, need not fall off the cliff maybe as much as we thought we were going to. Maybe it means at 23, there's a quarterback that they like there. Could be like a Bo Nix, depending on how you feel about where these players should be taken in the draft. I can't pin down what it means just yet for the Minnesota Vikings, outside of the fact that they're being very proactive in setting themselves up for the draft next month.
Well, I think you saw that the Minnesota Vikings clearly wanted to retain Kirk Cousins. They were going to give him a bunch of guaranteed money. They wanted him to stay. And
right,
that was their plan A. And kudos to the Vikings for pivoting and creating a plan B very quickly, which was, let's get Sam Darnold in here. Let's see if, quarterback whisperer Kevin O'Connell can do some magic with Sam Darnold and make him a bona fide starter. But the commitment to Sam Darnold doesn't preclude you from doing anything else and taking a big swing. Right. And that's what it feels like to me. It feels like you don't really give up a second round pick next year to be able to just get, I don't know, an edge rusher at 23 or just another guy on the roster. To me, this is clearly a move that says we want enough points on the draft capital chart to be able to get into that top 5 selection area because there is a guy we really need. And it wouldn't really make too much sense, I don't think, to try to get in there to get Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Neighbors when you have one of the top 3 wide receivers on the planet already on your team. So to me, this does scream, let's see if we can get our quarterback of the future and pair him alongside Justin Jefferson for the next decade.
Right, but so then I guess then is it the Patriots at 3 that they're going to target, right? Like that's I think the bigger question here now is like how far do they need to get and what is the position that you move to that gets you the quarterback that makes sense? Like we said this discussion about from a Giants perspective, JJ McCarthy, only 21 years old, right? Like, do you feel like if you went up the board to wherever it's required to get him, and you said, okay, now we have him and we have Darnold, we can let that have 1 year, and then we know that we'll have our guy going forward. And it advertises to Jefferson, as you say, too. Hey, don't worry. Like, we got the guy of the future. He'll be developing. Like, we're not going to fall off a cliff here, at which point your elite wide receiver may turn around and say, wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if I went and played with a number one quarterback somewhere else, right? So you can look at it that way, but it's hard for me to think like the Patriots might make sense at 3 to say we get 11 and 23 and we continue to build this thing. They brought back Brissett. Like I don't know if you believe in one of those quarterbacks at the top of the draft and you're one of those top 3 teams, are you backing out for that? And then if you're the Vikings, like, is it enough? Is JJ McCarthy the guy worth moving up for? Do you have to move up that far to get him?
Yeah, it's a great question. If you look at the NFL trade value chart in terms of what points different draft capital and assets are worth, Adam, I know this in mock draft season are the two things that get you super excited. Basically, picks 11 and 23 for the Minnesota Vikings equal just over 2,000 points in this point system. If they were to pair those together and try to move up the draft board, that basically could get them at least to number 4 with the Arizona Cardinals, which is about 1,800 points for pick number 4. The Giants sit there at pick number 6 with about 1,600 points in draft capital for that 6th spot. But when you get to New England, when you get to Washington, you're talking about 2,200 and 2,600 points. You're talking about they'd have to give up those 2 first-round picks and probably another first-round pick next year, or at least another second-rounder somewhere else, even though they traded away this one and next year's. So, Adam, it looks like their target, like right now, that draft capital can give them a swing to get them to number 4. And if they sit there and say they like JJ McCarthy and they think he's the guy, then you kind of sit there and say, we think 4 quarterbacks are going to go off the board relatively quickly. If we have the 4th pick, we're guaranteed to get one of those 4, right?
Yeah, that's what you'd have to assume. If you create that top 4 quarterback class, then it feels like you have an opportunity. Now, how does it relate to the New York Football Giants and where the Vikings may go on this board and maybe what the Giants want to do with the 6th overall pick? Let's talk about that because the Chargers fold right into this equation. Before we do, we'll let you know today's episode is brought to you by Pietential, Pietential. Pietential.com is an online wellness assessment tool, basically a free survey for individual users that allows you to set a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve, and also helps you track your progress along the way. If you're thinking about the absolute frenzied pace that is free agency and heading towards the NFL draft, go ahead and get yourself a little bit of a nice baseline well-being over at Pietential.com today. Okay, so the other thing is the LA Chargers. I was gonna say San Diego. They should still be in San Diego.
Superchargers, baby.
Exactly. The Superchargers, baby. They get their new fancy head coach, and their new fancy head coach says, jettison these old wide receivers. We don't want anything to do with them. They move on from Williams. They trade away Keenan Allen for a 4th-round pick, and I'm not even knocking it because I think you have to expect a little bit of a retool here. Immediately, though, the response is, so obviously they're going wide receiver at 5. And while that would seem logical because you have your franchise QB and he needs to have weapons, the second that I saw the Vikings trade and you think about them wanting a quarterback, I go, well, if I'm the Chargers and I can get 11 and 23, I can still get the tight end Bowers at 11 probably. I might still have a chance at Odunze at 11, though it seems very unlikely he falls that far. We don't know, depending on where people go in terms of offensive line or edge rushers in the top 10. And at 23, I can address the cornerback situation. I have maybe extra picks in the 2nd round. I can go legit wide receivers. There's a lot of ways that can manufacture. How likely do you think it is that the Chargers just sit pat at 5 and take? If it's not going to be Marvin Harrison Jr., they go and said, nope, neighbors, there you go. Here's our number 1 wide receiver for our QB. We're all set.
It's a good question. I think Jim Harbaugh looks at this and is like, listen, I think I can work with Justin Herbert. That's the reason why I'm taking this job. But we had him and we had a bunch of superstar guys all over the field on offense and defense. And what did we win? What did we win? Why did I get this job? Oh, I got this job because they won nothing. Literally won nothing. Choked away games. did not, Justin Herbert didn't ascend the way that everyone expected him to be. The defense played, poor, and Brandon Staley was a defensive coach. So there's a reason why he got this job. It's because they underperformed. And listen, they were way over the cap. They clearly kicked the can. Tom Telesco kicked the can down the road, former GM of the Chargers. And the cap hits, they had 4 of the 10 most largest cap hits in the NFL coming up. They had to make these changes just to even get under. And so obviously Mike Williams saved them $20 million against the cap. Keenan Allen saved them a significant portion too, trading away to the Bears for a 4th-round pick. What I think this allows them to do is be extremely flexible when it comes to the draft. I look at the Chargers now and I say, okay, if you believe in your franchise quarterback, you now have the opportunity to do a whole host of things. One is sit pat, do nothing, take the best wide receiver that's on the board, pair him up with Justin Herbert, just like maybe the Minnesota Vikings are going to do with their quarterback and Justin Jefferson, and you're set for a decade. Like, that's a great plan. If one of these quarterbacks decides to fall and someone is in love with J.J. McCarthy or Drake May falls, and everyone thinks the Giants are going to end up trying to get one of those quarterbacks, the Chargers are in a great spot to negotiate and say, if you try to wait, it's going to be gone. We're your last chance to get that quarterback. And maybe they go for pick 11 and 23. I think Harbaugh realizes there's more things that he has to do than just one player here or there. So I could really see the Chargers trading out of that spot, getting as much draft capital as I can, drafting the best wide receiver at 11 or an edge rusher at 11, and then looking at someone like Brian Thomas in the middle of the round to fill out the wide receiver room. You mentioned Brock Bowers could be someone that they look at. Like, there's a whole host of ways that they could transform this team. I think the Chargers are the most fascinating team going into this, knowing that they think they have their franchise quarterback, knowing that they have a coach that has been successful everywhere he's gone. Now you're giving him maybe more picks to do what he wants to do. To me, that would be a win for them.
Well, actually, it's funny when you say it as, you mentioned Brian Thomas there at LSU, and I was saying Bowers. It's like, even that, we understand what Neighbors is, or what Marvin Harrison Jr. not going to be there at 5 for them, or even in a Dunze. But even if it was just that, right? Like, we're talking about, you could address a lot of different areas of need. If I traded back from 5 to 11 and 23 with the Vikings because they want to go get their franchise guy, and I turn it into the best tight end and one of the best receiving weapons in the draft in Bowers, plus I go and get another guy that is perceptually looked at as being maybe as electric or close to as electric as Neighbors, but because he played with Neighbors, there was only so many mouths to feed there. Yeah, like, turn around and have 2 high-end weapons coming out of the first round to pair with your quarterback, right? So this is where I've already seen a lot of the chatter in different groups, that you get into after these things. Like, oh, of course, lock it up. They've gotten rid of their wide receivers. They're definitely going with wide receiver at 5. It just feels it'd be a little bit short-sighted to me, right? And this actually relates back to the Giants when we talk about, yes, they need a number 1 wide receiver. And if you can go get a guy at 6, like, let's frame it that way. What if the Minnesota Vikings come knocking? Let's say the Chargers do stand at 5 and they do take a player like Neighbors. And all of a sudden, the Minnesota Vikings are saying, well, we may need to get up ahead of a couple of teams there in the top 10 that are looking at J.J. McCarthy. The Giants decide they're not going quarterback. From a Giants perspective, are you willing to drop back there? Because now this is where this is the push here, Andy, because we're talking about the Chargers, and you're like, hey, man, you can go ahead and you can back up and get multiple weapons and do all this great stuff. But if it's the Giants that have to make that choice, and the Giants don't have their franchise quarterback yet, wouldn't then, like, do you hold the same logic that you have for the Chargers for the Giants? Hey, if we can back up and get 11 and 23 in the first round from the Vikings and add other pieces and do what we want with those picks as opposed to picking at 6? Or would you say, nope, sorry, Odunze, I've watched too much of him. I love him too much. I need to have him at 6.
I've said this before, and I've been consistent throughout this entire draft process. I would prefer the Giants to trade out of 6 rather than trade up. That has been my belief, that we're not just one player away from being super successful. I think if the Giants could trade the 6th pick for 11 and 23, it would be a little bit skewed. The Giants may have to give up pick 107 or something else, but
Right.
we know how crazy it can get when someone's on the clock and they desperately want their quarterback. If the Giants to J.J. McCarthy has been a smokescreen and Minnesota wants to get in front of the Tennessee Titans or someone else that may want a quarterback like the Denver Broncos, that's going to be interesting. I would prefer the Giants take the additional draft capital, figure out best player available at 11 and 23, and maybe the Giants walk away similarly to what we just talked about with the Chargers and they get a Brian Thomas, and they get a Dallas Turner, an edge rusher, or they get a cornerback at 23. To me, that seems like a prudent way to continue to build this roster. Even if you don't believe in Daniel Jones, then all of a sudden, when you do get that quarterback, you feel like the construction of the roster is way better than what it is.
And isn't the only, it's funny because the only difference here is it's not about the money being spent on your quarterback. It's not about like the state of the needs that your team has. Like Chargers need to get a cornerback as well. They need to add weapons. And it's the confidence, obviously, that if you believe in Daniel Jones versus do you believe in Justin Herbert, right? Like, that's the only difference here. These teams like are really built very similarly. And I think it's funny because where the Giants could get value out of this, if we're talking about the Vikings planning on coming up here in this draft, there is something to be said for when you talk about the Tennessee Titans. Now, the Chicago, we assume they're going to take a quarterback. Atlanta's already taken their quarterback, but then you're there at the Jets, right? Are they maybe considering, even though we think they're in win now mode, would they consider about their future as well? It is funny how this offseason has reshaped kind of the quarterback need chart here a little bit, because you could make the case if you're the Vikings, well, why we don't need to trade up with the Chargers if the Giants aren't going QB. We don't need to trade up with the Chargers because the Chargers already have their quarterback. They're going to go weapon here. Now then you go to the Giants. But the question becomes like, what is the next team that the Vikings need to get ahead of now if they want to go get a quarterback, right? Because it actually 2 weeks ago, it was like, oh my God, everybody wants a quarterback in the top 10. Now it actually looks a little bit thinner. And there's a world where at 11, are the Vikings, is it possible for the Vikings to be able to stay at 11 and still maybe get a guy that they want? You know, someone else is going to move up ahead of them, but how far do they have to go? Maybe the Giants are actually above where the Vikings need to move to secure it. And that's where the smoke screens come in. And if you're Joe Schoen and the Giants, you're like, hey, we'll take a QB here. Like, if you want your guy, we're the spot that you need to come to. Otherwise, we would take a JJ McCarthy because the value is too high for us.
Well, the question is, the Tennessee Titans sit right behind the Giants at
I know
7.
that's the one, right?
Are you convinced that Will Levis is the guy? Like, are the Titans convinced? Keep in mind, they just fired Mike Vrabel. They just, they're doing this whole turnover of everything. Would it surprise you if they went after Drake May if he fell, or JJ McCarthy if he fell, and reset their quarterback position? I don't think that's out of the question. So for me, I look at them right away. I look at Minnesota also thinking about Denver is lurking right behind them at 12. What if Denver leapfrogs them to go get their quarterback? There's, what if they like JJ McCarthy or Bo Nix or whoever it's going to be that Sean Payton wants as his new quarterback? They need a cheap quarterback because they have such a massive cap hit on Russell Wilson that them going to get a quarterback makes a ton of sense in the draft, right? So, like, for me,
Denver may not be able to go get a quarterback high in the draft because even a rookie scale contract is too expensive. They'd be like, honestly, if we have to pay a 6th overall quarterback pick, $6-7 million, I don't know if we can even afford to do that. We might have to just wait, another year before we can make that move.
But that's the reality for the Broncos. They decided to make this bet. So for me, I look at them as the clear cut teams that would do it. Obviously, the Las Vegas Raiders signed Gardner Minshew, but it doesn't feel like that's going to preclude them from being in to try to get their quarterback. So it's not necessarily whether or not Minnesota wants to stand pat. It's they have to be concerned with other teams potentially moving up in front of them, knowing that they have basically waved the flag to say we need a quarterback.
And again, and it's like, Chicago does become interesting, right? Because they sit there and the question is, well, obviously you assume they're going to take a Caleb Williams, but what is their intention there? Is there a weapon that they automatically want to pair? Or do they look at it as how enticing of a spot is this for teams that want to come get a quarterback? And maybe we want to make the margin move. So point being, I think, at least on its surface, after some offseason moves that started to say, oh, well, you're taking some QB needy teams off the board here. The move from the Vikings, at least to me, signals like, hey, they want to have the viability to get up there ahead of a team if they need to, and they have the assets to do so. You look at a team like you mentioned, Denver, I think they become really interesting, mostly because they may be really bad. So if you're a team like the Giants or the Detroit, we hope it's the Giants. If Denver's calling because Minnesota is calling, now Joe Schoen may have to look at it and say, well, I can get 1 first-round pick this year, but if Denver wants to give me future first-round draft capital for a team that is a mess financially and is selling off parts, we could turn around for the Giants and say, hey, we want to be competitive this season, and that's a bit of a hampering about getting our quarterback in next year's draft class. Suddenly, if we get Denver's first-round pick, at worst, we have 2 first-round assets that we can move up the board if we need to, and maybe Denver just ends up being another top 10 pick for us a season from now, and we get to have that flexibility. So I think like the long-term big picture here has to play a massive factor, and I would love, because all the reporting has been most recently, the Giants are making the calls, asking what it would take to get up to the top 3 picks. And Andy would say, then obviously they're not doing that because that's always the smokescreen, whatever gets reported. So maybe what I don't want to love to hear is the Giants are entertaining trade back offers. Maybe that's the last thing you want to hear between now and the draft, letting you know that they must be open for business, because I'll tinfoil hat like Andy would and say anything you don't hear is the most likely thing to happen.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Connor Hughes came out today and was like, the Giants have targeted J.J. McCarthy. He is their guy. You're hearing everyone else say they are calling everyone in the top 3. It's like, would Joe Schoen really telegraph like exactly what his plan was so that other teams could then be informed on the decision they want to make? To me,
Drew Lock confirmed today, buddy, that Daniel Jones is the starting quarterback for the New York Football Giants in his introductory press conference. We should just close out quickly and put that note in there. He was introduced. It's understood. Daniel Jones is the starter. Drew Lock showed up looking like a cat burglar. Like these are the groundbreaking information you expected to hear. I would have been more shocked if Drew Lock said, "Oh yeah, they told me it's an open competition." Like, by the way, let's end on that. All this draft stuff, we'll continue to break it down. Were you really surprised that Drew Lock, like, is this breaking news? Drew Lock was told by the Giants Daniel Jones the starter? Of course, that's what he was told. If he goes into camp and kicks and I don't think he will, but if he absolutely burns Daniel Jones and Daniel Jones looks injured or shaky, that'll change it. But no one thought that a $5 million guaranteed contract was open QB competition when it came to training camp if Daniel Jones is healthy.
Well, this all stemmed from the GM of the Seattle Seahawks, John Schneider, saying, we would have loved to have kept Drew Lock. We wanted to keep Drew Lock. Drew Lock was amazing. And it's the excuses why he couldn't sign his backup quarterback again. It was like, well, he had a better opportunity to start in New York, and they told him that he open competition. It was more like John Schneider making excuses why he couldn't keep his quarterback in the room more than it was like telling what was going on in New York.
Right.
So to me, listen, all of this stuff sounds like a whole bunch of smoke screens to me. Like I said on previous pods all week, I would be shocked if the Giants move up into the top 3 and draft a quarterback, because that's literally all we've been hearing. You haven't heard a peep since the combine about the Giants drafting a wide receiver. And to me, like, even though there's this big elephant in the room that we have a gaping hole with no wide receiver number 1 on the roster, we keep talking about quarterbacks. We keep talking about quarterbacks even after we sign another quarterback in Drew Lock. It's like, to me, it's kind of crazy. Like, the elephant in the room says we're missing a guy over here, yet we're focusing all the attention over here. I actually think that's good business if I'm Joe Schoen. I really hope that that's the case for the Giants.
And we said this to tie a bow on it, and we'll continue to talk about these narratives, obviously. But going back to, it was like, what would be the best scenario in a possible trade down was, well, maybe it's only a couple of spots, right? And then originally we thought Atlanta would be the team for that. They've obviously made their move there. But maybe it is. You mentioned the Titans, right? They want their guy, and they're hearing the rumblings of teams looking to come up. Maybe it is the Jets, though I think that that's less likely. You mentioned the Raiders. Obviously, we talk about Minnesota and all their draft capital. If the Giants can move back a couple of spots, one spot even with the Titans, and say, and we still get a Dunze, right? Like, if we can make that move and get a little extra in the coffers and still get a player that we want, it feels like at a minimum, the Giants are positioning themselves to be able to be open for business, all options on the table, and potentially, because of other teams' desperation, serve to profit off of it. Listen, whether or not you want to believe that the Giants and Joe Schoen believe in Daniel Jones and if he's healthy and all that stuff, we've always given you the idea that at a minimum, the Giants put all of these pieces in place for whenever the quarterback comes in, this year or next season, whenever that time comes. So you can still build a roster, not be totally elated about Daniel Jones playing quarterback, and improve this team, though, going forward and give yourself a nice baseline. And maybe that's what helps them when we talk about some of these little bit more QB desperate teams, even if you think the Giants should be. Go ahead, Andy. We'll close out.
Very quickly to piggyback off that. At the end of the day, Adam, there are quite a few different podcasts and sources that will talk to you ad nauseum about what the quarterback will mean, what J.J. McCarthy in the room will do for the Giants, what they're going to do to trade up to be able to get them. We are not necessarily going to be one of those podcasts. We're giving you the idea of all the different ways that Joe Schoen could use this, not focused on one particular position. I would prefer they go wide receiver. We're okay with them trading back, but also to your point, we're okay with them taking a quarterback too if that's what Joe Schoen ends up wanting to do. All options need to be on the table, and that's the best part. You never want to pigeonhole yourself. The Giants are in a good spot right now.
Do not get pigeonholed. And by doing that, you get over to YouTube, you check us out at One Giant Podcast, turn on the alerts. We've been doing a ton of lives over this past week. We'll probably have more coming as news and notes come out. We'll have some mock drafts. I'm going to be licking my chops to get in there on those as well. Over on social, at One Giant Podcast on Twitter, at AndyMac214, at Adam Armbrecht. We'll be breaking it all down, coming back next week once Andy gets his screen up, gets the lighting right. Hey, listen, at least the sultry sounds of his voice were still as smooth as ever. Until next time, as Andy would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.